Good evening. As Luke said, we're going to talk about the crucifixion of Jesus tonight. And I want to thank him for leading those songs and helping us to center our minds around Christ. And I do want to look at the crucifixion, probably in more detail than most of us are usually comfortable with thinking about it. And first off, I want to start with Roman crucifixion, who they crucified, and why they crucified them. Crucifixion was the most horrible, painful, torturous, and humiliating form of execution that anybody's ever come up with. If the Romans wanted to kill someone quickly or without a fuss, there was a lot of ways that they could do so. So crucifixion was for a specific reason and purpose. It was reserved for special cases. The two most common were low-life criminals and enemies of the state, enemies of Rome. These were the people they typically crucified. This was their ultimate punishment for their crime. And it was a spectacle as a warning to others around who may consider doing the same things. And we think of capital punishment, what crucifixion was for Rome, a little differently nowadays. For America, it's very different. And here in the U.S., we have due process, and appeals can take forever. It's not just a quick trial. And the whole goal is it's private, it's swift and painless. It's away from the public view. But for Rome, crucifixion, this capital punishment, it was as public, torturous, drawn out, degrading, and humiliating as they could possibly make it. That was the goal. And so if you think of a thief in the U.S., they might be put behind bars for a little while, have some jail time, and then get out. But a thief in Rome was crucified. They were nailed to a cross in a public place so that everyone passing by could hear them scream and see them writhe in pain for days. And then they'd leave the dead body on the cross so that birds and dogs could get it. That was what crucifixion was. And you can see or understand how many thieves they would probably have after just a couple times of that. You wouldn't want to be a thief. So the whole idea was this is an effective way of getting rid of crime. It's supposed to be a disincentive for crime. And so for those opposing Rome, what got you put on a cross? What specifically got you put on a cross? Well, resisting Roman military action, cross. Get caught attacking Roman troops, cross. Plotting to overthrow the Roman government, cross. Not people who just didn't like Rome very much, not people who wished things were different, people who were actively against Rome. And they did this, Romans crucified these people, these enemies of Rome, because they wanted to show how helpless and powerless people were against them. They said, anyone who thinks they can stand against Rome, who can defy Rome, this is what we're going to do to you. And we'll show you how powerless you really are. So it was a symbol. We'll show you how powerful you really are. We'll show you how helpless you are. And it's also a warning to others that if you oppose Rome, this is what we'll do to you. And then also, they didn't allow burials for crucifixion victims. This was almost always the case. When someone was crucified, they were not allowed to be buried. Now, everyone in the ancient world, it was important to them to have a decent burial. We don't think about it the same way nowadays, but for them, often it was required to have a decent afterlife. They thought, if I'm going to have a good afterlife, I have to have a decent burial. And so it was also a way of honoring this departed person. And so not receiving a burial was disgusting, barbaric, gut-wrenching, debasing, humiliating. It was horrible. Nobody would wish that on their enemies. And so Romans didn't allow crucified victims to be buried. Because they didn't want to cave to the desires of these people that they were trying to teach a lesson, that they were trying to say, okay, you think you're going to defy Rome? This is what we're going to do to you. And of course, they wouldn't want to bend to then what those people wanted would be a decent burial. There was no decency allowed. The body has to rot, and then they would just toss it into a mass grave. They might make, an occasional exception for some low-life criminal who nobody really cares about, but certainly not for enemies of Rome. Those people had to be made an example of. And the reason I'm saying all of this is Jesus was killed on a political charge. Jesus called himself the King of the Jews. That's why they crucified him. And that was the inscription put on the cross, King of the Jews. So in Roman eyes, Jesus was going to lead a rebellion. Otherwise, how could he be king? He wouldn't be a king if there is no kingdom. So to be a kingdom, there would have to be a rebellion against Rome. So rebellions had to be suppressed violently, mercilessly, and forcefully. There was no quarter, no mercy, no sympathy. And so this isn't our focus today, but the fact that Jesus was allowed a proper burial is pretty amazing, because it didn't happen. And this is something I want to stress in this lesson, that Jesus wasn't like every other crucified victim. Jesus' crucifixion was different. And I want to start in Luke chapter 22, as far as looking through the scriptures. Luke 22, I want to start with Jesus in the garden. And we have all the Gospels talk about this, but I just want to look at this one. Luke 22, starting in verse 39, which says, "And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter into temptation.' And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and knelt down and prayed, saying, 'Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.' And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, 'Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray, that you may not enter into temptation.'" So there's three things to notice here. With Jesus in the garden, first we notice his knowledge. Jesus foretold his death multiple times to his disciples. He knew that Judas was going to betray him. We can see that in many other places. And here in verse 42, Jesus reveals that he knew what was about to happen, which is what we're talking about tonight. Jesus knew that he was about to be crucified. He says, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me." Jesus knew it was coming, and he didn't want to go. Jesus didn't want to be crucified. I mean, when we think about it, Roman crucifixion, it was common during Jesus' time. So it's almost certain that he witnessed others being crucified. When he's coming into Jerusalem or going somewhere else, he's coming in the city and he sees that. And just think about that. If you're going throughout your life and you knew that's where you were headed, you knew that was the end of your path, could you go through with that? Jesus knew, and he probably didn't just see one crucifixion. It was probably pretty often. He probably saw quite a few, at least passing by. Not like he necessarily stayed to watch, but he saw quite a few. And so knowing that that was the path laid out for him, have you ever had something you know you have to do, but you dread it so much because you know how horrible it's going to be? Well, whatever that is for you, it's nothing compared to the cross. it's nothing compared to crucifixion. Have you ever thought about what the worst way that you could die is? I've thought about that. Like, I would just hate to drown. I think that would be horrible. And I'm one of those people that thinks about that kind of thing. And so I think about it like, if I knew I was going to drown one day, I don't know how I could face that. Like, how could you know that and then still be willing to go through with it? And yet Jesus knows he's going to be crucified. And he's seen other people crucified, almost certainly. And yet he's here. He's in the garden, right where he knows he's going to be betrayed, arrested, and taken away to be crucified. He knows where he's going, and he's still here. So that's the first thing we see is his knowledge. Then we also see his agony. And this is before the crucifixion even starts. But knowing this, knowing what's going to happen to him, Jesus is saying, I don't want to do this. In verse 44, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. There's actually, I think since this was written, they've discovered medically what this is, hematidrosis, which we probably heard that before. I don't know. I've heard that before, but looking into it a little bit more, it's caused by a high degree of psychological stress. Makes sense. Jesus is about to go to the cross. But what's even more brutal about this, about Jesus sweating blood, is when this happens, it makes your skin extremely sensitive, which would have increased the pain of everything else he's about to go through so much, significantly. The scourging, crucifixion, it would have been that much worse because of this agony that he's in. And so notice Jesus' response to this situation, to his agony. It's prayer. Verse 41, and he withdrew from them about a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed. Verse 44, and being in agony, he prayed all the more earnestly. Verses 45 and 46, and when he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping for sorrow. And he said to them, why are you sleeping? Rise and pray, that you may not enter into temptation. And Jesus, I would say to you, was really tempted. He was really tempted to not go through with this. He didn't want to do it. And so he prayed. And also notice that an angel here appears to him, strengthening him, just like we see when he was tempted in the wilderness by Satan. This was hard for Jesus. He didn't want to do this. But we also see his submission. After saying, Father, if you are willing, please remove this cup from me. He says, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Think about the humility, the selflessness, and the submission you would have to say this under these circumstances, knowing what you're about to go through. Later on, Paul says in Philippians, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. It's like the thing parents say to their kids, at least my parents said this to me when I was younger, would you jump off a bridge if someone told you to do it? Usually because the kid is doing something stupid that their friend told them to do. But with this, that's basically what Jesus does. Of course, not for the reason of stupidity, but out of love and obedience. And it's also not pointless. Like, I think most of us would have a hard time jumping off a bridge if God told us to do it, much less willingly submit to crucifixion. But again, that's exactly what Jesus does. He does something harder than any of us has ever had to do, showing us it's possible, setting an example for us. We next have Roman scourging, which we mentioned a moment ago, with how Jesus' skin would have been more sensitive than normal. So Roman scourging, look at Mark chapter 15. And we'll start in verse 15. Mark 15 and verse 15. It says, "So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion, and they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they were striking his head with a reed, and spitting on him, and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him." We don't get a lot of detail from any of the Gospels about what Roman scourging was like. And I think that's because everybody knew. They saw it. They knew what scourging was like. We know a lot more about it from historical accounts, just historians writing about what it was like. And it was customary before crucifixion to be scourged and beaten, and that's what we see with Jesus. First of all, Roman citizens could not be scourged. They thought it was too harsh, something that Romans, if you're a Roman citizen, you will not be scourged. Because many people would die from scourging alone. They wouldn't even make it to the cross. That's how brutal this is. And so Jesus, or anybody who would be scourged, they're usually stripped naked, and tied to a post or a wall with the entire back of their body fully exposed. And then they have this whip. Maybe we think of something like Indiana Jones, or when your sibling, when you're younger, takes a wet towel and they roll it up like this and they snap you with it, and that hurts. But obviously it's much, much worse than that. Now, it's a whip with an 18-inch long wooden handle, like that long wooden handle, with 9 leather thongs. I think today we'd call it like a cat o' nine tails. And each of these are about 6 to 7 feet long. They're braided with metal balls, like fishing sinkers. And there's pieces of sharp bone and metal at the end. And the idea is that the metal would dig into the back of the person being scourged, while the bone cut their skin. And so as lacerations from the bone dug deep into the flesh, the Roman legionnaire would flick his wrist and pull pieces of skeletal muscle out, so they were hanging like threads from the person's back. And part of their spine was sometimes even exposed. That's how deep the cuts were. It's more like Jesus is being stabbed than whipped, it's just probably a more accurate description or understanding of these wounds. And just, can you even imagine that? And then with this whip, we have the lashes. Just one would make a cut 2 inches long and about 3/4 of an inch deep. A cut that would take, today, 20 stitches to close. And I say just one, that's not one lash. That's one of the thongs, one of the 9 thongs. So there's 9 of those, with each lashing. So with one blow, the Roman legionnaire could inflict a wound that would take 180 stitches to close. And usually there would be 2 Romans alternating from different angles, different sides of the person they're scourging, and the typical number of lashes was 39. So these 2 Romans would inflict wounds that would take about 2,000 stitches to close. And the person was scourged from their back of their neck or their shoulders, all the way down their back, the backs of their arms, their bare buttocks, their thighs, their calves, and even their feet. Literally their entire backside of their body. And then Jesus not only is scourged with this whip, he's also beaten. And so this scourging by itself would have left Jesus in critical condition. And usually the degree of scourging determined how long someone lived on the cross. Again, many people died from the scourging and didn't even make it to the cross. But they didn't just scourge Jesus, they also beat him, mocked him, and put a crown of thorns on his head. You know, his face probably looked something like Rocky Balboa's whenever he finished a fight. Both eyes swollen shut, his nose pouring blood, his lips are tattered like paper, and maybe even has teeth knocked loose or knocked out. In Isaiah 52, verses 13 through 14, it says, "Behold, my servant shall act wisely. He shall be high and lifted up and shall be exalted. As many were astonished at you, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of mankind." Jesus was so beaten up, he was so marred, that he was virtually unrecognizable. That's how bad this was. And in Mark chapter 15, where we were here, verses 17 and 19 says they're twisting together a crown of thorns that they put on him. And they were striking his head with a reed. These thorns are like 1.5 to 2 inches long. Imagine basically the length of a toothpick. And these things are as sharp as an ice pick. And they're hard enough to penetrate a wooden table, something like this. They're hard enough to penetrate through the outer parts of your skull. And they're pushing these into Jesus' head. And it was customary for them when they would do this. They would take a 3 to 4 foot long reed and slap the person's head. Slap the head of the victim to drive the thorns into their skull. So every part of Jesus' body was marred and covered with blood. I mean, it's hard for us to even imagine this level of violence today. Imagine how horrible that would be. We don't see anything like that. And then we have the cross. Look at John chapter 19. Starting in verse 16. John 19, verse 16 says, "So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, 'Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews.'" So we have the cross. Firstly, we have the crossbar. In Latin, it's called the patibulum. This is about 125 to 150 pounds. And it's this rough, unfinished piece of wood with splinters and spikes and rough places in it. Remember the description of Jesus' back from being scourged? And then you put something like that on top of him. And so it's tied to the victim, and they carry it from the place of their condemnation to the place of their execution. You know, it's interesting in the other Gospels, Simon of Cyrene was compelled to carry his cross. But here it says Jesus went out carrying his own cross. And we're not here to talk about that. But the upright for the cross was usually reused and located outside the city where they would have the crucifixions typically. So they would carry the crossbar, this heavy piece, and attach it to the upright there, and then lift the whole thing up once they nailed the victim to it. And so we have the nails. They would have laid him down on the cross to nail him onto it. The nails were 7 to 9 inches, and they were made of iron with square edges on the head, and they're driven through his hands and his feet. His arms would have been stretched about 6 inches too far. then they could go to dislocate his shoulders. So how could someone have, all of this happen to him, the nails driven through his hands and feet? How could he have this and not bleed to death? We're trying to understand something about Roman crucifixion. Like, we can't take that kind of blood loss. But the Romans had perfected the art of pain and suffering. They figured out a way that he wouldn't bleed to death, that he would feel everything. They figured out if they drove the nails, instead of here through the middle of the hands, through the middle of the wrist, they could avoid hitting any arteries or veins. So it's not in the palm. I don't know if you'd think that, but it would have, if they put it in the palm, it would have pulled right out from between his fingers under the weight of his body, and he would have fallen off the cross. They drove it right in the middle of his wrists, and they missed the radial and ulnar artery, so he wouldn't bleed to death. And they drove it through the biggest nerve in the hand, the median nerve. And they did the same thing here with the feet. Right between the first and second metatarsal bones, missing the dorsal pedal artery. And I don't know any of these terms. I had to look all of this up. But the important thing to know is he's not bleeding to death from this. And in both his wrists and his feet, they're driven through the plantar nerves. So both for his wrists and feet, this causes a horrible electric shock sensation in both his hands and his feet from the nerves being crushed. The doctor's description of it, he says, the kind of pain that you have when you hit your funny bone on something. Well, picture taking a pair of pliers and squeezing it to crush that nerve. He says the pain was absolutely unbearable. And that's not the end of it. The breathing. For crucifixion, it was an agonizingly slow death by asphyxiation. Jesus didn't really have difficulty inhaling. I didn't know this before. The tough part was exhaling. He would have had to push up using his feet in order to relieve the pressure on the diaphragm and just temporarily exhale. This breathing motion would go on and on, him pushing himself up, scraping his back against the cross, until he became just completely exhausted and unable to push himself up to breathe anymore, to breathe out. And so with every exhale, every word, it took tremendous effort and came with unimaginable pain, which makes Jesus' words on the cross that much more beautiful and precious. The effort and the pain he had to go through just to say the little bit that he said. Every word. And then the way that he dies, and also in John 19, verse 28, it says, after this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, he said, to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for the Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other, who had been crucified with him. But when they had came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, that you also may believe. For these things took place, that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And again, another scripture says, they will look on him whom they have pierced. Excuse me. So remember, people typically survived for days on the cross. That's because crucifixion wasn't intended to kill somebody. Yes, it did lead to that, but it was to make someone suffer as much as possible before breaking their legs, which was pretty much always how they killed them. And they designed this method of execution to last a long time. So breaking their legs was pretty much always how they killed victims on the cross. And sometimes this took a while. It's not like they just hit a button or something and their legs are magically broken. They would take a blunt instrument, either the handle of a spear or an iron club, and repeatedly hit the shins of the crucified until they shattered. But that's not what happened to Jesus. They break the criminal's legs, but when they come to Jesus, they notice that he's already dead, so they don't break his legs. Instead, they pierce his side with a spear, and blood and water comes out. And I think Rob talked about this a couple weeks ago, and we don't need to go into lots of detail on it, but it basically just indicates that Jesus had been dead for 30 to 45 minutes at least. And this was done to fulfill Scripture. As John says from Zechariah 12 and Psalm 34, these things were done to fulfill Scripture. And the point is, they broke the legs of the criminals next to him, but they didn't do that to Jesus. Jesus didn't die the way crucifixion victims die. Notice verses 28 through 30 again. Specifically verse 30. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head, and he gave up his spirit. No cross, no man, no Roman took Jesus' life. Jesus gave his life. He gave it willingly. In John chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, Jesus says, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father." So remember, the Romans wanted to show how helpless and powerless the victim on the cross was. That was the whole goal. But Jesus was anything but helpless and powerless. He was more powerful than we could imagine. We're going to sing a song after this lesson about how he could have called 10,000 angels, but he didn't. He died alone for you and for me. That's what Jesus went through for us. He gave himself. He submitted himself to God's will, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. And of course, we know that after this, he rises again. Like he said in John 10, he takes up his life. He conquers death and he gives life. And that's what this gospel is about. This gospel is about a crucified Christ. In 1 Corinthians 1, in verse 18, also in verses 23 and 24, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." And then later he says, "But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews, and folly to the Gentiles, but to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God." The crucifixion doesn't make sense to the world, but to us, it's the power of God. No one else could have done this. It had to be Jesus. He gave his life. He was crucified for us. But there's something more about the crucifixion. Look at Mark 8. And we're wrapping this up. Just one last point. There's something more. Mark 8, verses 34 and 35. Jesus tells us, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it." And also in Matthew 10 and verse 38, he says, "And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me." And so what does this mean? What does it mean to take up our cross and follow Jesus? And that could be a whole another sermon, but just let me leave you with this. Turn to Hebrews 12. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. It says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood." And there's a lot there, but basically, look, I know it's hard, and sometimes you feel tired, like you can't go on. And the things of this world can weigh us down. So look to Jesus. Consider him. He endured the cross for you. He endured the hostility for you. He despised the shame. And now he reigns. He's seated at the right hand of God. He is the founder and perfecter of our faith. So let us get rid of the things that are holding us back and weighing us down and run. Run the race that is set before us. Drink the cup that God has given us. Endure. Resist. Whatever it takes. Whatever point it gets to. And just read one last passage with me in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. And after this passage, we'll sing our invitation song. Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. And just real quick before we read this. As we read this, I want you to picture Jesus hanging on that cross. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because he loved you. Because he gave himself for you. And then I want you to imagine yourself, not down on the ground, watching Jesus up on the cross, looking up at him. I want you to imagine yourself as one of the sinners on the cross next to him. And you can choose which one you are. You can choose to be the criminal that blasphemes Jesus, saying, "Aren't you the Christ? Save us and yourself." Or you can be the one who recognizes that you deserve to be on that cross, not him. And you can say to Jesus, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And what he says to that sinner is, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Galatians 2 and verse 20. "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Won't you come while we stand and sing?